Hello and welcome. I'm Sean Walter, and I'm the author of the book Tales in Sombre Tones. The book is a short story collection that myself and the artist Karen Ruffles started putting together over 2 years ago now, and have been working on turning into an inclusive modern art and literature project. We had originally planned a live touring show starting in the UK with access materials, readings, physical 3D prints of the artwork that were designed to be experienced by touch. But due to everything being as it is, we've done our best to move to a live streamed version. And that brings us to today. Today I'll be reading three stories to start with. I'll be taking a short break and then returning to three more with the help of our sign language interpreters right here. And with Karen ready to answer any questions made in the comments on the video itself, so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Our first story is Scavengers. All right. So the trees frame the image of a small body of water. The perspective is from the shore, shrouded in shadow. A fallen tree branch guides us from the shore and into the water where a strange, inhuman hand reaches up from beneath the waves. It's the image description for those of you who might want one. Emily walked along the narrow forest road on her way home. The night had not been going well. Her date for the evening, a bullish man named Colin, had picked her up from her home, and they had gone to a party in the next town over. The party had started pleasantly enough, but after a few drinks, Colin became more and more forward with his advances toward her. When he groped at Emily, after already being told off for it twice, she punched him square in the nose. She had broken it. She was certain, because noses aren't supposed to look that way, and besides, she had felt the cartilage snap under her fist. Nobody at the party would give her a ride home, so she began to walk. That was a half hour ago. She kicked a stone down the pavement, and it fell into the roadside ditch with a splash. She glared at it. Light spilled around her from behind, and a familiar car sped past. Emily ducked into the forest and behind a tree as the car screeched to a halt. Colin's drunken voice called from the road, "Emily!" There was anger there, soaked in alcohol. Emily briefly entertained the idea of finding a very large rock to beat Colin senseless with, but thought better of it. If I can avoid this idiot, all the better. But when I get home, I'm going to the police, she promised herself. Her mind made up, she ran into the forest. The moon was full, and light made its way through the sparse canopy with ease, so she was able to keep up a quick pace. By her reckoning, her home was less than 5 miles in the general direction she was headed. She would be there in no time at all. But the forest grew denser the further she went into it. The canopy grew thicker, and soon she lost the light. Colin was still shouting from somewhere behind her, following her by sheer luck. Still moving quickly, though blindly, through the undergrowth, she ran into a low branch that snapped from its trunk. She stumbled, righted herself, then grabbed the fallen branch for protection. Dark or not, she knew roughly how tall Colin was, and could easily locate his head with her new club. Up ahead of her in the forest thinned into a clearing, illuminated by the moonlight. Reasoning that seeing a pissed-off woman with a large stick just might scare even an absolute moron like Colin, she made for the clearing. She was only a few yards into it before she fell. The first sensation was the cold, like ice engulfing her whole body, pushing the air from her lungs. She breathed in from shock and took in a lungful of putrid water. She dropped her club in the scrambling to gain purchase on something, anything, to get to the air once again. Finally, she was able to surface, coughing and gagging on the water. She kicked in her heavy boots and swam in the direction of the shore. She pulled herself onto the muddy, grassy earth and promptly threw up. Emily saw nothing for several seconds as she lay on the shore, coughing out the water she had inhaled, and then she remembered Colin and jolted upright. There was some rustling in the underbrush across the small pool, and she knew Colin had heard her fall. She searched the shore for anything she could use as a weapon, but something in the water caught her eye. Her mind immediately jumped to the thought that it was an alligator, with how it insinuated itself along the surface of the water. But even in this low light, she could tell that it was no alligator. It moved too quickly, and with too much determination. Besides, she thought, as logic kicked in, alligators don't live in this part of the world. And then, none of that mattered anymore. The pain in her lungs disappeared. Her anxiety vanished, and all was calm. Even the ominous dark pool with its unknown creature seemed comforting to her. It was as if every care in the world suddenly didn't matter. Not Colin, not the thing in the water swimming closer, not even surviving. She didn't even care how or why it had happened. The creature breached the water, and it was beautiful. Its green hair, its elongated eyes, the almost human-like torso it used to climb onto the shore, dragging its gorgeous tail from the pool. Emily was absolutely captivated. She reached out to the smiling creature. And Colin burst through the underbrush and stumbled drunkenly into the pool. The creature turned, startled, and Emily could think clearly once again. The edges of her vision, so soft a moment ago, hardened as reality took hold. Colin was thrashing about in the pool, and something was far too close to Emily. What she had taken to be hair appeared to be algae-encrusted tendrils. Its eyes were sheets of glass, wide and unlidded, taking in all the light they could. The torso, while nearly human, was plated in scales, terminating in webbed hands. It smiled, constantly, unable to close its mouth from the size of its sharp teeth. Emily raised her booted foot and kicked at the creature's head, sending it rolling into the water with a hiss. She stood up and retreated to the now inviting forest. From the safety of a tree, she turned. Colin had stopped thrashing. He was holding on to the eroded edge of the shoreline with one limp hand, and the creature was slowly rising from the water. Its shark-like tail flapped happily as it curled around Colin's torso. Colin pulled it toward him, pawing at what might have been breasts, and he leaned in and tried to kiss the creature. It reacted in a flash. Its massive mouth opened, and it wrapped its long, sharp teeth around Colin's jaw. It pulled away, and the lower half of Colin's face went with it. But he didn't stir. He didn't scream or defend himself. He simply drew the creature closer, as if he were cuddling a loved one. A moment longer, and the blood-soaked monster sank its teeth into Colin's neck. Colin let go of the shore, and they both slipped beneath the water. Emily wasted no time. She turned away from the pool and ran, bumping into trunks and bushes, running headlong into low branches, yet she kept going. When she emerged from the forest, she ran on. When she finally reached home, she locked the door behind her, gathered her breath for a moment, and screamed. The coming days and weeks came with a search for Colin by the police. They tried to question Emily about the fight at the party, but she only stared at the floor the entire time. The police documented her bruises and scrapes, thinking they understood, and left her in peace. They searched the forest where his car had been located, but when 2 of the searchers vanished into it, they soon called it off. For years to come, whenever someone went too far, whenever they were deemed beyond salvation, Emily would take them for a walk in the dense underbrush, and they would never be a problem to anyone ever again. Alright, our next story is Fairy Tales. Deep in the forest by night, everything is shadow save for a large bough where a rope swing dangles in rays of bright moonlight, which are filtered through the canopy, the ivy, and the moss of the forest. Since time immemorial, whenever people had gathered together for warmth and drink, there would also be someone among them to tell tales. It's such a staple, such a commonplace occurrence the world over, that it's not difficult to imagine that the first pub came with a slightly loud, slightly grizzled old man who said that he had invented the pub years ago. Ours was named Steve. He could have been 40 or 400, never seemed to shave nor grow excess whiskers, and knew exactly 15 jokes which he repeated time and again to anyone who would listen long enough. Those who knew him never warned the new victims of his particular style of humor. It was far more fun to let them suffer, to have them look at you with a face of confusion or of horror, and slightly mouth the words, "Was that the joke?" in astonishment, as the old man roared with laughter. Tonight, Steve was in fine form. "I met the Queen once," he was saying to someone who hadn't asked as I walked in. "What? Of England?" the woman asked. "No, of course not," he started. "But didn't you just—" "I met the Queen of the Elves," Steve finished. The woman frowned at him in annoyance. "Right," she said, then turned back to her companion, whispered a quick conversation, and they both hurried away to the back table. "Scaring people again, Steve?" I asked, taking the stool next to him. "Some people just don't know a good thing when it comes along," he replied, smiling into his thin beer. I made a face. "How can you drink that shit?" I asked. "It tastes like someone telling a story about a bad beer they had once, being heard through a wall." "Well, it's thin, sure, but I can drink it all day." He laughed, and right on cue, started joke number 11. "My dad always said this kind of beer was like making love in a canoe." He paused, his smirk frozen in place as the bartender groaned. "It's fucking close to water!" he shouted, then slapped his own knee and started laughing again. The bartender and I shared a look, and she sighed. "Porter?" she asked. I nodded. "Oh, come on!" Steve yelled. "That was funny!" I shook my head. It was only a little funny the first time I heard it, but I was also a lot younger then and easily amused. I smiled at him as his face fell. "Have I told you that before?" he asked. "Twice this week," I replied, and laughed. Steve paused. "Well, when you get to be my age, we'll see just how good your memory is." "How old is that, anyway?" I asked. "As old as my nose and just a little bit older than my teeth." He laughed as I rolled my eyes. Some time passed, and the beer flowed. Steve told 6 more jokes from his repertoire to unsuspecting customers as they ordered. Some laughed politely. Others said nothing and wandered away in a hurry. Eventually, in desperation, I asked, "Steve, don't you have any new stories?" He leaned back in his chair and thought for a moment. No, he replied, and laughed. All right, I pressed on. How about some old stories, then? He paused, his beer halfway to his lips. Then he set it down without drinking. Old stories? I didn't think anyone wanted to hear old stories. I shrugged. Old or new doesn't much matter. So long as we haven't heard them before, we'll be happy. Really? Steve asked. I nodded. In that case, maybe I do have an old story for you. I ordered another porter and some thin swill for Steve, then sat back to listen. Years ago, he began, before all of this was here, before the houses got built and the shopping districts, and before all these people came, this whole area was woodlands. The trees themselves weren't old. You didn't get old-growth trees around here, even back then. But the forest itself, as a whole, was ancient in the extreme. I had grown up on the outskirts of the forest, spending my days helping out with the chores when I wasn't in school. But you should know, back in those days, school was a thing you attended when you could, when your chores and your life allowed it. The wealthy family all had private tutors for their children, while the rest of us made do with whoever was capable of reading and who could write and do math for that week. I looked at the bartender, confused, and she only shrugged. How long ago was this? I asked. Don't interrupt, Steve replied, then continued. The only school in the area was through a thinning in the forest, along an old dirt trail that was used mostly by those who wanted to get to and from our collection of homes and farms. We weren't really a village in those days. We didn't have any official name or local government. If pressed, we would say that we belonged to the next town over. So it wasn't strange that my school was so far from home, and it wasn't odd that I should be gone from sunrise to well after sunset. It was simply how things were done. One day, just as the sun was rising, I set off for town for a day of schooling. I remember how thick and cold the morning dew was that day. My coat was heavy with it by the time I reached the forest. It was dark there, in the trees, and my path was lit only sporadically by the rays of dawn. But I was cold and on a mission, and took very little notice. The path went through the narrowest part of the forest, but it wound and meandered through the growth of trees, wherever carts could find a route. So the journey itself was several miles long. I knew the path by heart, could even follow it in the dark, so I wasn't worried. That is, of course, until the singing started. Steve took a long pull from his thin beer, then continued. It was a kind of rhyme to my ear. I couldn't make it out. The song came from a ways off the path where the trees and underbrush grew thick, but my curiosity drove me to find it. My coat, an oversized ordeal I had inherited from my father when he no longer had a use for it, caught and snagged on a bramble bush. The singing was nearby. Some of the words were beginning to make sense, and I felt an odd urge to press on, with or without my coat. So I left it hanging there in the brambles. I remember thinking the air wasn't nearly as cold as the further I moved from the path. A few minutes of stumbling in the dark further, and I found myself in a glade. Light shone through the branches above, but the forest here was strange. Branches and trunks grew at odd angles. One was almost horizontal, and attached to it was a simple plank and rope swing. It was quiet, but it was a pregnant silence. The kind of silence that only comes with someone or something trying incredibly hard not to be heard. The singing had stopped, but it was almost as if the vibration of the voice could still be felt in the air. The wind blew through the glade, and the swing began to gently sway. A whisper came from the darkness, but I couldn't make it out. A deeper, steadier whisper replied to the first. "Hello," I called out, hoping I hadn't scared them. I just wanted to see who was singing. I didn't mean to startle you." I moved further into the clearing, out into the light, so whoever was there could see me. "Did you like it?" a voice asked from behind me. I turned and staggered, and caught my hand on a sharp branch, cutting my palm as I fell. I stood up and pressed my wounded hand to my shirt instinctively. When I regained my composure, I looked just back to see a young girl, no older than I was, coming into the light. She was barefoot. I remember thinking how odd that was, and her thin features and dark skin caught my eye. "Was that you? The singing, I mean," I stammered. She nodded enthusiastically. "Did you like it? I've been practicing for a long time." Her voice was soft and bright. It reminded me of springtime. "It was beautiful," I said. She smiled at me, and I was lost. All thought of continuing onward to school was forgotten. She walked past me to the swing, but strangely never once settled back down to her heels, her toes gripping deep into the mossy earth. "What was it you were singing? I couldn't understand it." She sat down at the swing and began to gently sway in the breeze. "It's from an old song that's from an old place. I'm not sure it translates to your language very well." I went and sat down on a stone nearby the swing, watching her sway back and forth, admiring the grace of her movements. She began to hum, the same tune that I had heard as I approached, and I felt as if I was wrapped in warmth. I must have been hypnotized by the movement, or the humming, or her beauty, because I was soon fast asleep. Steve paused as his next beer arrived, seemingly lost in thought or in memory, back in that glade once again. After another long pull on his beer and a sigh, he continued. "I dreamed then. I dreamed of strange creatures made out of earth, others out of plants, and of elves and fairies, and demons of fire and ice, and people made of pure light, and others made out of the night sky. I couldn't make sense of it all as it marched by me, but I heard her singing, on and on, through it all." I awoke in total darkness. My head rested in her lap, and she gently stroked my hair as she sang. I tried to lift my head to get up, but it was as if a force were holding me down. "Shh," she whispered. "You're safe here." I tried to respond, but nothing came out, and I was so very tired. I barely felt the needle-like claws gently raking at my skin, nor the tingle of my senses slowly fading away. Somewhere in the darkness, a deep voice growled and rumbled, and then I passed out once again. I awoke to the sound of an axe on wood, in stark daylight so bright that it was blinding. I felt stiff, as if I hadn't moved from an uncomfortable position in days. I was still in the glade, but it was different somehow. Memories of fantastic creatures and nightmares turned flesh kept flashing before my eyes. I stood, disoriented, confused, and looked around. Everything seemed smaller somehow. I was dressed in strange fabrics and silks, and my hand had healed. Somewhere behind me, off in the distance, beyond the now rotted ropes of the swing, I could hear her, giggling at my confusion. It took me some time to realize it, but years had passed as I slept, if I was ever asleep at all. I have the feeling that whatever she was, She stole most of my memories from those years. Steve looked around at the bartender and me, as if surprised to see that we were still listening, and he smiled. That's all, I'm afraid. The bartender shook her head and turned away to wipe the far side of the bar. I looked at Steve for several seconds, studying his face. How much of that story was true, Steve? I asked. He turned to me, his usual grin on his face, and said, How much do you believe? Then he set some money on the bar for his drinks, nodded to me, and turned to leave, humming a strange tune to his own delight. Alright, the next story is Addictions. A cobblestone street at night. The storefronts lining either side are closed up and shuttered. Fog permeates the view of two human figures walking away, seen only as shadows from a distant street lamp. The man on the right is distinct and reassuringly solid, but the woman to his left is wispy, her outline blurred. Fragments of her tattered dress and the locks of her hair are rising into the air as if caught in a draft that surrounds only her. The night was cool. Wind came from the east, blowing ash and sparks down the dark, deserted street. It had to be done. He knew that. There was simply no alternative. If he hadn't done it, someone else surely would have come along to do it in his stead. But it had to be him. He didn't have a choice. The lights and sirens flew past him as he walked into the mounting fog. Just this last one, he thought. I can quit after this. He meandered, taking a left here, a right there, twisting and turning his way along, going further from that inferno he had started and the horrors within. It wasn't until he stubbed his toe and tripped on a hidden curb that he realized just how thick the fog had become. He pulled himself up and sighed, and the sound of his own breath seemed dull and far, far away, like a cat hissing through velvet pillows. He had never liked cats, he mused, as he began to walk once again. They always seemed to know more than they should, as if they were witness to his past, as if they could comprehend what he had done and had chosen to condemn him for his deeds. That woman had a cat. It was what had captured his attention in the first place, days ago, as he passed in the night. The cat had been left out, and he spotted it scratching and complaining at the front door to the house. It had quieted when he approached, and looked up at him with pleading in its eyes. He had simply let it in. And that had been that. Another turn, and he narrowly avoided walking into a signpost. He held his hand at arm's length and marveled at the fact that he could no longer see it. Streetlights formed small, bright cones above his head, but the light barely reached him. He wondered briefly if he had walked out of the world, and if he would ever be found again by any living creature. The muted world of the fog folding around him, holding him, hiding him from the world of the living. He laughed at the absurdity of it all, and heard a woman gasp just in front of him, hidden by the mist. He smiled at his fortune. "Oh, I'm sorry, miss," he said in what he thought of as his most charming voice. "I was enjoying not being able to see my own feet in this weather. Did I frighten you?" The woman in the fog laughed nervously. No, I'm all right. I just didn't see you there. I nearly ran into you." "What a tragedy I laughed when I did then," he smiled. then remembered that he needn't bother. "Right," came the reply, after a moment. Look, do you happen to have a lighter? My matches are useless in this damp." He dug in his pocket for his lighter and held it out where he had heard her voice, then flicked it to life. He stared at the flame, reduced in clarity but just as beautiful as the blaze it had started. He could almost hear the screams of the woman within the shape, and see how she had stirred and flailed against her bonds as she burned in the dancing of it. Out of the fog, on the very edge of vision, a cigarette emerged. It struck the flame and roused him from his reverie. He laughed again. "You know, there's something a little unsettling about a disembodied cigarette seeking a light from out of the fog," he said. "It's better than what looks like a severed hand offering you a lighter," she replied. "Fair point." He hesitated for what he hoped was just long enough, then added, "I hate to ask, but I don't suppose you know where we are right now." The woman laughed. "I was hoping you knew. I've been wandering in this mess for what seems like ages. Are we near High Street, do you think?" He turned his head to look back on where he had come, and couldn't tell one direction from another, save for the glow of the streetlights above. "Your guess is probably better than mine. I'm not from around here." He tried to sound as pathetic as possible. "Oh, you poor thing," she started, and he smiled to himself. "How did you end up here?" "Oh, I quite enjoy walking in the fog. When I saw this rolling in, I just couldn't resist," he lied. "What about you?" "I just wanted to take a walk to cool off. It was too hot inside." He smiled once again at a private joke. Aloud, he said, "Would you like to stumble along blindly together?" "I don't know. You might be an axe murderer," she joked. "Only on Saturdays. This being Wednesday, you're perfectly safe." She laughed. "It's Thursday." "Even better. Those are for drownings." She laughed once more. "All right, fine. But you better not lead me into any walls." "You have my word," he said. "No walls." They began walking, unsteadily, into the damp, gray air. Every few steps she made her presence known by taking a drag on her cigarette, making her appear in subtle orange shapes. Here a nose, there a chin. "So, where are you staying while you're in town?" the shapes asked. "At the moment, nowhere. I was staying with someone until a few hours ago, but that didn't work out, and I decided to leave." "I know how that is. There's a small hotel somewhere around here. If we can manage to find it, you could probably stay the night there." "Oh, I'll manage, I'm sure." They turned a corner, each following the other by sound alone. They talked on random subjects, the kind one talks to a complete stranger about to pass the time. 4 times, as they wandered, they reverted back to the topic of the weather. How odd it was, how surreal, and yet neither seemed to tire of it. A car passed by, slowly, like a ship sailing out on an ocean of fog, only making itself known by its headlights. He caught the faintest image of her face in the glow. It was oddly familiar, like a half-remembered dream from years ago. The blanks filled in after each retelling with logical, purposeful ideas. "Any closer and that thing could have killed us," he murmured. "I'm sure we would have bounced off. Probably." Her face lit up with an orange glow once more as the embers came to life. Smoke flowed from her lungs a moment later. "That's a really bad habit to have," he commented. "Is it? I really only just started tonight." "I wouldn't let it take hold if I were you. I've always found habits near impossible to break once I have them." "And what habits have you got then?" she asked. He smiled. "I'll tell you about it later. In the meantime, could you blow that away from me? I can't stand the smell of smoke." She laughed loudly. "What's so funny?" he asked. "You are. How can you say that you don't like the smell of smoke?" "I just never have. I don't see how that's funny." "You're obsessed with fire and hate smoke. I think that's hilarious." She laughed again. "I always burn things on my way out. That way I don't have to smell it much," he said. "I see. That way you can enjoy the flames from a distance. Is that it?" Uh, exactly." They walked on for a few moments. "How did you know I enjoyed fire?" he asked, finally. "You'd be amazed what you can learn after spending a few days with someone." Her voice was harsh, almost ashen in the sound. "Days? It's been an hour at most, I'm sure," he chuckled. Her face glowed orange in the fog once more, brighter than before. "You're not lighting up another one, are you?" he asked. But the glow didn't fade. It held there, then seemed to spread to the fog around them. He watched as her skin cracked and peeled, blooming in firelight from within. She exhaled a plume of thick, black smoke. The air became oppressively hot, and he fell to his knees, coughing into his sleeve. He tried to crawl away, but she reached out her hands and grabbed him by the wrists, holding him in place like a vice, torching his flesh wherever she touched him. The flames spread all around them. His lungs burned, his vision blurred and faded, and the roar of the fire filled his ears. He screamed until he could no longer breathe, struggling to inhale through seared-off lips and burned lungs. Just before he fell unconscious, she pulled him into an embrace, scorching every inch she touched, and whispered in his ear, "Just this last one. I can quit after this." All right, we are going to take just a short break. We will be back in just a few minutes, so we will see you guys shortly. All right, welcome back. Unfortunately, I forgot to put up this image for the last story, so you guys were stuck with Fairy Tale's image before. But this is the image for addictions, and I am terribly sorry about that. That is entirely my fault. And we are going to move on to Jinxed. A sharp contrast of light and dark. The center shows a cat's collar with a bell. Within sits a middle-aged man in a pinstripe suit, going over some paperwork. The shadows from without the collar form inhuman hands that reach towards the man's back. Real quick as well, the captions unfortunately will only be available on the replay of this. YouTube no longer does them live for their live streams, so we will have them up, I promise. If the moon hadn't been full, Oscar was sure none of this would be happening. He wouldn't have dreamed of harpies stalking him from the rooftops. He wouldn't have slept through his alarm and been late to leave for work, and he wouldn't have spilled his coffee down his shirt as he wove in and out of traffic. But it was a full moon. Oscar decided that his bad luck had been compounded by the moon. It was as if the last 31 years of life had been lived so carefully avoiding spilling salt, hanging horseshoes points up around his house, and never once having broken a mirror, had annoyed the powers that be, and they had simply been waiting for an opportunity to attack him while he was vulnerable. He turned onto his office building street, but his eye was drawn to an alleyway he'd never noticed before. It appeared no different than any other, and yet he felt compelled to stop his car and explore it. He saw a black cat from the corner of his eye run from the sidewalk and in front of his car. He swerved at the very last moment, avoiding the cat and cursing his further bad luck. He parked, collected his backpack full of work materials, and stepped out of his car. And there he saw the same black cat waiting patiently across the street, sitting on the stairs to his office building. It was staring right at him, tail twitching this way and that, waiting to ambush him once again. Oscar cautiously approached the entrance, trying to avoid the cat's eyes. He nearly jumped out of his skin when the cat let out a small brrr and put one paw forward, hesitated, then sat back down once again. Shaken, Oscar took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and dashed through the door. He slammed it closed behind him, then rested against it while he caught his breath. "Meow!" came the call from the other side of the door, along with several seconds of scratching against the doorframe. Oscar bolted up the stairs to his office. The morning carried on as it had begun. Oscar messaged the wrong client and exposed the preferential price of another, resulting in a contract loss for the company. He then opened a chain letter in his email that was alarmingly close to being past the deadline for sending on, and before he could finish forwarding it, his computer froze. By the time it was rebooted, the deadline had passed. He dropped his head in his hands and sobbed. Already behind and having infuriated his boss by his earlier mistakes, Oscar decided to eat lunch at his desk. He worked studiously while mechanically chewing on a bologna on rye. He finished and went to throw away his sandwich wrapper in a trash bin below a window, which looked out onto the street 3 floors below. He glanced out of the window and saw his car, safely tucked where he had left it. And there on the hood, curled up in a mockery of innocence, lay the void of a black cat with the expression of pure contentment. Oscar stared down at it for several moments, scowling, wondering what he had done to deserve today, and if he could avoid it in the future. The afternoon passed slowly, Oscar's work crawling along at a jagged pace, burdened by his constant worry. In his mind, unbeknownst to him, the cat had somehow found a way inside his car and now waited in the back seat, ready to pounce on him as he drove home to cause a fatal accident. He wondered if death by cat was a common problem. Night fell. The workday was coming to a close, and Oscar was worried. He packed his bag slowly, carefully, not sure what else this day would bring him. He went down the stairs and inspected the scene through the building's glass exit doors. The black cat was still there, its eyes glowing in the low light as it rolled around playfully on top of his car. Oscar waited until the cat was distracted by other passers-by before he opened the door and began to down the sidewalk, away from his car. It was several miles back to his home, but he could walk that. Perhaps he could get lucky enough to catch a bus, and then in the morning he could take a cab back to work. Yeah, he thought, that'll work. Something brushed against his leg. He looked down to see the cat purring loud enough to be heard over the passing cars, repeatedly rubbing itself against his slacks. Oscar jumped back and slammed into a wall, gasping in alarm. The cat sat down and cocked its head at Oscar, watching his desperate flailing and chewing motions with interest and amusement. but showed no signs of fleeing. Panicked, Oscar edged along the wall, keeping the cat in view, watching for sudden movements. The mouth of an alleyway was just a few feet away. Oscar hoped to reach it before the furry evil which watched him with such interest could follow. When he was within inches of the alley, the cat ran forward and began meowing for Oscar's attention. There was a pleading in its tone. When it saw that it was being ignored, it ran beyond the entrance of the alley and flopped over on its side, then rolled to its back, cocking its head to catch Oscar's reaction. Oscar turned into the alley and ran, leaving the cat and its insistent mews behind him. He smiled to himself. Finally, something was going right with his day. The alley was dark and cold, sunlight rarely reaching into its depths. Oscar walked along its unfamiliar twists and turns, pleased to have lost the black cat, but worried that he may have gotten himself lost in the same time. As he walked on, the place grew stranger. He turned another corner, certain that this direction must lead to a main road, but where he expected to see people and cars, he only saw more narrow passageways between brick buildings. All of the trappings of humanity were around him, dumpsters in their usual place, odd bits of wind-blown trash stuck in piles here and there, but it somehow felt off. Sounds seemed to travel slower than they should. It was as if he was wandering through a physical echo of a location, something similar to the original, but subtly changed. The alley grew darker as he went, a kind of strange, insidious darkness that grew by degrees when not being watched. It took several more minutes before he noticed that there was nothing leading into the alleyway. No disused coal chutes, no one-way emergency doors, no windows or holes in the walls. He didn't know where he had been, nor how to return. The only way to proceed was forward, into the maze of interwoven brickwork. Oscar paused. Something had been drawing his attention for quite some time. Something on the edge of hearing that suddenly made itself noticed. A strange sort of staggered whisper. Soft words spoken quickly and rhythmically filled the air. Out of the darkness ahead, Oscar watched a man in tattered clothes shamble towards him. The man was gibbering to himself, staring down into his hands as he shuffled along. Oscar tried to back away, only to find that his feet would not obey him. They stayed planted against the concrete, no matter how much he pulled on them. The stranger drew closer. When he was a foot away, the man stopped. His hands slowly lowered from in front of his face, and he raised his head. Oscar gasped. The man's eyes were nothing but black pits, absorbing every bit of light they could in this dismal place. It showed brown, jagged teeth through cracked lips and what Oscar could only assume was a smile, and then began to whisper excitedly. Oscar, Oscar, it called in a sweet voice. It reached out and caressed Oscar's face, repeating his name like a mantra. Finally, it gripped Oscar's chin in its fist. Oscar, we've been waiting for you. Its smile widened, its teeth grew, and its mouth opened. The cat sat in the entrance to the alleyway, hopeful that the man would return, sad that she couldn't stop him from going in, and unsure why he had acted so strangely toward her. She waited until she heard the scream, and then she moved on. There was always a scream, but she waited, every time, just the same. Maybe, she thought, she could save the next one that caught the alley's attention. This one is titled The Deal of a Lifetime. A mostly rolled up sheet of vellum, spotted and stained with age. Norse runes cover the unrolled portion, and a half-seen symbol begins a demon's contract. It doesn't work that way anymore, the man had said. Joshua hadn't believed him. Not about any of it. Not then. But now. It had been a bad day. Joshua's phone had given up the ghost sometime in the night, causing him to sleep through his alarm. He rushed into work as fast as he dared, breaking several traffic laws in the process. He arrived to his boss, Mr. Stoner, fuming behind the counter of the little clothing shop. "Where the hell have you been?" Mr. Stoner shouted, his multiple chins fighting for dominance on his face. Sorry, my phone died last night, and I used that for my alarm." Joshua held up the black-screened phone as proof. "It won't happen again." "You're goddamn right it won't. What if there had been a customer here, waiting for you to show up? What then? Then we miss out on profits. No profits means no pay." Joshua wiped a bit of saliva off his face and stared at Mr. Stoner, clenching his fist, considering his reaction. From behind him, a small, sweet voice asked, "Excuse me, how much is this?" Joshua nearly fainted with embarrassment. Before he could turn around to answer, Mr. Stoner pushed past him and went toward the customer. "I'm terribly sorry," he said, his voice all milk and honey. "You know how it is with the youth these days. You can't make them earn an honest living if you beat them with a stick." He turned to glare at Joshua. Joshua was seething for what remained of his shift. After work, he headed to his girlfriend's house, hoping to get some sympathy for the day he'd had. On the way, he stopped at a repair shop, the sign out front hanging on a rusty steel bar, blowing in the wind, read, "We repair it all. Phones, computers, lives," with a faded pyramid in the background. Joshua shook his head and went inside. The interior consisted of a small alcove, 3 chairs, a small sliding glass window with a bell sitting on the track, and a doorway leading further in with a sign saying "Employees Only." Nobody was there, so Joshua rang the bell. "I can help you," a man who was standing alarmingly close to him said. "What model phone do you have?" he asked, without being prompted, and went through the door and appeared behind the window. The man didn't have the appearance of a repair technician. He wore a pinstripe suit, smartly fitted to his trim figure, complete with waistcoat, tie, and pocket square. His hair was greased upright and back, and stood in nearly identical rows upon his head. Joshua handed him the broken phone. It just died in the night," he said. The man took it and began holding it down one button while tapping on the screen with a stylus in a complicated pattern. When that failed to produce a result, he took the back cover off and examined the battery. Finally, he set it on the counter in front of him. "You have a real problem, sir," he said. "What? Don't tell me you can't fix it." "Oh, no. Your phone isn't broken. It's just depressed." Joshua looked at the man. The man smiled back. He didn't appear to be a mad person. "My phone is depressed?" he asked. "I'm afraid so. Worst case I've ever seen, too. But you're in luck. I know just how to fix it." Joshua braced for the ridiculous repair fee the man was sure to quote. "How?" he asked, holding his breath. "It's really very simple. All you have to do is kill your boss." Joshua furrowed his brow. "What?" "I'm afraid it's the only cure at this stage. Before, it would have sufficed to simply find other employment. But after hearing how he treated you, The man shook his head and shrugged. Of course, what with you being a new customer, we could take care of that whole messy affair for you. Free of charge as well. We believe very strongly in repeat business. Joshua stared at what he now was certain was an escaped mental patient. Even though the thought of killing Mr. Stoner had come across his mind, he never really considered it. Okay, he stammered, confused and worried about upsetting the smiling madman behind the glass. Excellent, the man said joyfully. We'll take care of everything. Don't you worry, sir. Right, Joshua said, taking his phone back. Well, I've got to go now. Thanks for your help. The man beamed. Not at all. And do come back. I'm certain that we can help you again. Joshua left the strange man and continued to his girlfriend's house. Once there, he got so wrapped up in telling her about Mr. Stoner that he forgot to mention the strange man wearing the suit in the repair shop. Beth, his girlfriend and woman of infinite compassion, listened to him and consoled him. Somehow, she always made him feel better. Later that night, as Beth and Joshua slept in each other's arms, Joshua's phone rang. Still half asleep, he answered it. What did I tell you, sir? Came the voice from the other end. Now your phone is happy once again and working just fine. The day's events came rolling back to Joshua all at once. What? He breathed. What did you do? Why, only what we agreed to, sir. Your free introductory offer. We do apologize for the delay in service, but these things are best taken care of at night, the voice continued. Joshua sat silent for several seconds. Eventually he said, So you're telling me that my boss is eliminated? Yes, sir. We do hope you've enjoyed working with us, and do come in any time should you have another problem that needs repairing. Good night, sir. The line went dead. Joshua sat in bed, staring at his now perfectly functional phone. He used it to get online and went to the local news website. Their current stories scrolled along in a sea of continuous information. Breaking news. Body found in local shop. He read the details of the story with interest, and then, calmly, he turned off his preset alarm for the next morning. Joshua awoke still confused about the events of the previous day. He thought about his boss and was surprised at just how little he cared now that he was dead. He got up, got ready, and went back to the repair shop. The not-so-mad man in the suit was waiting for him. Hello again, sir. I see that you were most pleased with our first encounter. How can I help you today? Joshua glanced around the small, empty room. What is this place? He asked. Just a repair shop, sir. And just like it says outside, we repair it all. Which reminds me, we do realize that last night's unfortunate events have left you wanting for work, the man said, still cheerful. I can always find more work, Joshua started. Oh, of course you can, sir. No one is saying you can't. However, since we had some small part in your current circumstances, we wanted to offer you another deal. What kind of deal? Joshua asked, curiosity getting the better of him. Oh, for starters, we will get you gainful employment, something that you'll not only enjoy but will excel at. Secondly, we will pay you a small sum of monies as compensation for your lost wages and any unpleasant feelings you may have experienced on the matter. $10,000, say. Joshua laughed. What do I have to do, sign over my soul or something? The man in the suit smiled even wider than before. Oh, it doesn't work that way, sir. Not anymore. And then he explained how it did work. Joshua started his new job a week later. The job itself was, as advertised, enjoyable in a way Joshua hadn't thought possible, and even he had to admit he was very good at it. His work took him all over the world, and though he missed Beth from time to time, he was making enough money that by the end of the first year they had bought a house together. Soon they started a family. Beth was able to quit her job and work on her own interests at home. They hired a nanny to take care of their kids. 5 years later, after starting his new life, Joshua received a promotion. No more would he have to travel all over the world for his work, which suited him just fine. He had been wanting more and more to be at home with Beth and the kids at night. Now he waited in his office, reminiscing about the last 5 years, all of the people he had changed, all of the circumstances he had improved, all of the lives he had ended, and he was proud to be so very good at his work. The man was right. It didn't work that way. None of it did. You see, the man in the suit had said years ago, one soul is not enough. What is one soul when you could have hundreds? A pale, scared man opened the door to Joshua's office. It was his second visit, and he looked at Joshua without speaking. Thousands. The man took off his hat and wrung it in his hands, unsure of what to say. Why did it have to be my wife? He choked on the word, and a tear streamed down his face. Millions. Joshua smiled. That's just what we agreed to, sir. Okay. The next story is titled A Deal of a Lifetime. Oh, I did it again. No. There we go. Lost at sea. A human skull peering through the inky blackness of the ocean floor. A crab, uncaring and unconcerned, crawls through the skull's open mouth. Fragments of shells litter the shadows around the skull. The storm came out of nowhere. Marius clutched at the ship's wheel in a death grip, swearing as he turned the bow into another wave. They were coming too frequently, and he feared that his small ship's motor wouldn't be able to keep up with the sea's demands. He saw the wave forming ahead of him and drove his ship onward, hoping to pass over it before it broke. He felt as if he were on the world's most dangerous roller coaster, climbing slowly, the anticipation building, knowing that what goes up. His ship crested the wave and began barreling down the other side. Marius looked out of his ship's window onto a chasm of churning water. His grip failed him, and he was tossed astern, hitting his head on the wall and falling unconscious. To his amazement, he woke up, still afloat, and in calm waters. It felt eerily quiet after the din of the storm. Marius reached up to check his head for fractures, but he seemed to still be in one piece. He stood up, unsteadily, and saw nothing but a thick, bright fog. Marius checked his equipment to see where he was, but none of it seemed to be functioning. He sighed. Somewhere outside, off in the fog to starboard, someone was calling to him. Marius, came the sing-song voice of a woman in the distance. Marius swayed, his head becoming heavy. He suddenly felt like he had to go somewhere. Somewhere in the fog. Ahoy! Came a voice to port, drifting in through the crack in the window. Anyone aboard? Ahoy! Marius went on deck and spotted the dark figure of a ship. Ahoy yourself! He called back. My GPS is fried from the storm. Can you lead me to shore? I can take you where you need to go, the man responded. Marius managed to get the engine started, followed the ship ahead of him for what seemed like hours. Yet the brightness and density of the fog never wavered. Concussion, he thought. I'm not registering time correctly. Eventually, the outline of land came into view, and soon after, a small wooden dock. "Tie up where you can!" came the voice of the mysterious benefactor, and Marius did as he was told. He took his first few steps off the ship, his legs expecting the dock to move just as the sea did, and nearly fell over. He was caught by the arm by a bear of a man. "Careful now," the man said. "Get your land legs back under you." "Thanks," Marius replied, noticing the familiar tone of the man's voice. "You're the one who led me here, aren't you?" The man nodded. "Nils is my name. I thought I'd better take a look over the waves after the last storm. There's always someone who doesn't heed the warning signs that needs collecting." He eyed Marius gravely, then winked and smirked. "Don't fret now. It happened to all of us, one way or another." Marius shrugged, but cracked a smile. "I suppose. My name is Marius," he said, offering his hand. They shook. "Now that the pleasantries are over, we should be on our way. It doesn't do to linger in the fog for long." Nils looked out under the thick clouds, as if he recognized something, and then shook his head. "Come," he said. Nils walked ahead of the dock, on the dock, while Marius marveled at the array of boats tied to the simple wooden structure. Canoes, life rafts, even longboats decorated with Norse figureheads were dotted all along the shore, and more piled up on a rocky beach. "Where did they all come from?" he asked, unwittingly. "Oh, them? Oh, most of them have been here for years, but they all come from the same place you did." Nils smiled at his confusion. "You'll see," he concluded. The fog thinned as they marched up a stone pathway further inland, and Marius was oddly sad to see it go. They passed through a small fishing village, and the inhabitants all greeted Nils as an old friend. Something seemed odd to Marius. They were beyond the village when he finally sorted it out. "Why were there so few women back there?" he asked. Nils scratched at his beard. "Well, you could say that's the product of the occupation," he said, quickly moving on. "We're not far from where we're headed now. We'll get you cleaned up and taken care of." They pushed through the thin forest and up a hillside. The fog continued to thin. Looking back, Marius could just make out the lights from the fishing village in the distance. The path took them to a town nestled in a clearing in the trees. The townspeople all nodded in greeting, or said hello to Nils as he passed, and he replied to each greeting warmly. "You're quite popular," Marius said as they wove their way toward the large building in the center of town. "That I am," Nils replied. "It's my natural charm." He started chuckling at his private joke. Marius rolled his eyes. They entered a great wooden building, where they were met by a small crowd. The entire construction seemed to be one massive room, with a ceiling so tall that it disappeared into shadow above their heads. Marius blinked at the odd mix of people. Some men in leather jerkins, others in t-shirts and jeans, and still more in old military uniform, bleached and torn but recognizable. They all stopped their conversations as Nils entered the room. "Only one today," he said, to the general nodding of those around him. "I think there may have been more, but with the fog—" He let the sentence trail off. "A fine catch," one of them called out. "I wouldn't have gotten the one," called another. An old man, bent with age and dressed in colorful robes, came forward and held his hand out to Marius. "Welcome," he said. "We'll sort out a place for you to stay in a few days. In the meantime, you can bunk with any of these men." Marius shook his head. "I'm sorry, there must be some confusion. I can't stay. I just need some repairs to my ship, and then I can make my way home." The old man turned to Nils. "You bastard," he said, his face growing dark. "You never have the heart to tell them, do you? Never do the hard part yourself." Nils rolled his eyes. "Isn't going and fetching them hard enough?" he retorted. It isn't, and you know it isn't. Whoa, hold on, Marius interrupted. Would someone tell me what's going on here? What didn't someone tell me? The old man glared at Nils, who sighed, defeated, and turned to Marius. You came here on your ship, right? He asked. Marius nodded. Okay. Well, I saw that ship, and I can tell you that it's an awful lot for one man to handle. I would have expected at least 3 or 4 men aboard. So tell me, where is your crew? Marius thought for a moment. The memory seemed to fight him all the way, but finally he remembered. They were on deck when the storm hit. One was washed overboard, but the other made it back in. When I got knocked out, he was below, making sure the engine didn't go out on us. But he wasn't there when you came to, was he? No. I guess he could have taken a lifeboat, and left you behind, bleeding on the deck. Was he that sort of man? Marius shook his head. Where did he go? He asked. Nils rubbed at his temples. I'd wager he died, lad. Just shortly after you did. Marius smiled. Oh, right, great joke, he started, and then he looked at the faces around the room. Nobody was smiling. But I mean, I don't... You hit your head, lad. You hit it hard, and it killed you, Nils said, quietly. If that's true, if I'm dead, then why isn't my crew here with me? Where are they? The old man patted him on the back. As near as we can tell, the ones who drown go elsewhere. We all know that the sea is jealous, a greedy creature. We assume she simply doesn't let them go once she has them. You died before you went under, Nils interjected. That's why you were there when I came looking. Marius ran his hand through his hair. Something outside, far out to sea, was calling to him, barely on the edge of hearing. He knew that he must choose now and live with the consequences. No, he whispered, turning away and running outside. The people in the town made no attempt to stop him as he ran past. They only looked on him with pity in their eyes. When Marius reached the edge of the forest, he gasped. The area surrounding the docks, visible now that the fog had burned off, was covered with ships. Battleships from the world wars sat alongside wooden galleons, troop transports, private yachts, even Roman quinqueremes dotted the bay. He saw people moving along their decks, carrying on with their work. Someone grabbed his arm and spun him around. Nils stood there, holding him in place. Where do you think you will go? He asked, turning him toward the sea once more. Out there is oblivion. You were lucky that you didn't get sucked down and drowned the first time. Do you really think the sea will let you get away twice? Nils let go of his arm and took a step back. This is as good as it gets for us, lad. There's no going home, and there's only fools who try. I'm not going home. I have to know what she wanted. Don't you understand? I have to go. Nils' eyes went wide. She can't be trusted. You wind up trapped in the deep with the others. Marius backed away. I have to go, he said, and he ran. He reached the dock, climbed aboard his waiting ship, and started the engine. As he was pulling away, he saw Nils standing on the dock, watching him leave, unable or unwilling to stop him. The further from land Marius went, the thicker the fog became. He could feel something out there, watching him, waiting. It wasn't long before he was hopelessly lost. After a time, his engines quit, and he was adrift on the current. Somewhere in the fog, something called to him again, something sweet and promising. He had to know. He had to see it for himself. "Marius," came the woman's alluring call from the fog. "Come join us, Marius." And he did. Right, so that is all the stories I have for you today. Um, Thank you very much for tuning in. We will be back again next Sunday at the same time. Probably a slightly longer show that day, so uh, I hope you guys enjoyed all of the stories. Let me just make sure there's nothing pressing that needs my attention. Nope, we're all set. Thank you guys very much. You guys have a great day.